In the past, much has been written about the Shroud of Turin. It is called the Shroud of Turin because Turin is the name of a city in Italy, where this burial cloth is kept. There are many discrepancies as to the authenticity of this burial cloth. Some say that it is true, others say that it is false. Yet, how many of you know about this Christian relic? Not many of you do. Sinologists, scientists, anthropologists and the likes are all fumbling around and guessing in their laboratories trying to concoct reasons why people should believe and worship the Shroud. Why? So that they would have some other way to make you spend your money. Now by the mere mention of this word shroud, you should pose questions in your minds as to its authenticity. The question that you should be asking concerning this definition is, why did they use the name Shroud? Why couldn't it have been called something else besides Shroud, especially if it is claimed such a holy Christian relic? I'll tell you why. Because whenever the Luciferians is trying to deceive you, he puts in a little truth. Within his lie, herein lies the truth. Just by the fact that Shroud means to protect or to conceal, the Luciferians are telling you that he is trying to protect something about whether it is his lies or concealing something about the truth. The truth to the matter is, the Shroud is nothing but a hoax. Why do people who call themselves learned and strict adherents of the scriptures consider the Shroud so holy and sanctified? The Shroud is a piece of cloth with an image, which means that these learned scholars are ignoring the laws and commandments of the scriptures. The scriptures specifically states not to worship or bow down to graven images, idols, Exodus 24:5. Exodus 24:5. You will not make for yourself any Fezel idol at all, any Tamunal likeness in the Shamayim skies Mahal above or that is in the planet Earth from beneath or in the Mahayim waters from under the planet Earth. You will not Shakha prostrate yourself to them, nor Abad serve them. For I Yahuwah Elohik and Akana jealous El the one Fakwad visiting the one iniquity of the Awb father upon the Bane children up to the Shilesh third and Ribbai a fourth generation of them that saw ne hate me. Right translation in Aramaic, Hebrew, Bai, Netter, Ephrati Atamri. Why do you worship the Shroud? Why do you worship those statues and pictures of Jesus as God? You may say that the Shroud is not a graven image. However, the way you make the Shroud or any other picture a graven image is by saying that Jesus, whose image you Christians say is on the Shroud, is God. Had you said that the image on the Shroud was only an image of Yeshua, Jesus, and not the Heavenly Father, there would be no problem. The sin comes in when you give the Creator an image. He is not Yeshua, Jesus. The Shroud of Turin is not the image of Yeshua, Jesus, whom you believe was God manifested in the flesh. The Shroud of Turin is nothing but a big farce to deceive you. Shroudists claim the blood and burial spices on Judas, who they thought was Yeshua, body, interacted and caused an image on the Shroud. However, the image on the Shroud of Turin would not have been as precise as they made it seem. Just by the mere fact that the Shroud was wrapped around the body, would tell you a complete, undistorted head-to-toe image would be impossible to obtain. The Bible speaks about burial clothes, but they never mention the burial clothes as being marked, or printed on. Since everything else about Yeshua, Jesus, is documented, wouldn't you think that this type of information should have been recorded? According to the American Heritage Dictionary, the word shroud is defined as, shroud, noun, a cloth used to wrap a body for burial, winding sheet. Something that conceals, protects, or screens in the manner of a garment. Shroud, verb, to wrap, corpse, in burial clothing. To envelope, screen, hide. Christians claim that the Shroud of Turin is the identical shroud that the body of Yeshua was laid in after his supposed crucifixion. It measures approximately 14 feet, and 3 inches long by 3 feet and 1 inch wide. This cloth is made of a mixture of cotton and linen woven in a herringbone pattern, which is, according to textile experts, it is identical in material, and it weaves into many fabrics from the Near East of the 1st and 3rd century. This piece of linen is ivory in color, almost yellow, and it has bum marks, which run down its side, as a result of a fire, which occurred in the year 1532 AD. Watermarks which resemble rough-cut diamonds, are still visible on the shroud from when the fire was extinguished. Visible are the marks from triangular linen patches which were applied to the worst bums by nuns from St. Clair en Ville. Other marks appearing on the shroud are 2 feigned images of a body. Shroudists state that this cloth had been laid lengthwise on the body, beginning at the heels and proceeding up the back, to the base of the skull, over the head and down to the toes. The picture portrayed on the shroud is of a man with an owl-shaped face, eyes opened, and a long nose. The mouth is only a smudge beneath the nostrils. The hair appeared to be long and stringy, hanging to the shoulders. The only other visible points on the body are the hands, which apparently were folded over the loins. Also on the shroud are the dull red stains of blood, or at least what some think is blood. Large droplets from under the hairline, suggests that a tom-like instrument was placed on the victim's head. Wounds from the nails resulted in large spots of blood on the hands, and tricklets on the arms. The supposed gash on the victim's side resulted in the most bleeding. The blood had gathered around the hole, the side of the body, and the small of the back. Dully wrapped, the body was temporarily placed, according to Christians, in a narrow tomb, the property of Joseph of Arimathea. Shroudists say that this representation of Yeshua was his way of leaving a visual record of what happened to him in the bloody hours of his death. The Shroud of Turin was introduced in the mid-14th century, in a town of Liry, France. This shroud was first discovered by a famous French knight, by the name of Geoffroy de Charny. It is not quite clear how he gained possession of the shroud. It has been said that he won it as a spoil of battle, and his granddaughter holds to this claim. But his son claims that it was given to him as a gift. So it stands vague as to where he first obtained the shroud. However, a few years after Geoffroy de Charny founded the monastery of Liry, 1353 AD, he presented it with the shroud. In the year 1452 AD, Margaret de Charny, the granddaughter of Geoffroy de Charny, she was at the time the only survivor of the family, and consequently, the last legitimate owner of the shroud. And she took the relic to the court of Chambéry, where she presented it to Anne of Lusignan, wife of Louis, Duke of Savoy. From then on, it has belonged to the House of Savoy. Duke Louis of Savoy built a special church at the chapelle where the shroud had been glorified by the Catholic Church. In 1532 AD a fire broke out in the sacristy of St. Chapel, at Chambéry. And before the Christians were able to retrieve the shroud, drops of molten silver from its casket dropped on the cloth, and scorched the comers of the folds. Large stains were left, as a result of the extinguishing of the fire. There is no earlier record of Die Shroud of Turin that has been documented, prior to the 14th century. However, it has been said on the year 1204 AD, the Knights of the Templars organization took over Constantinople. Among those relics that were found, there was what was called a burial cloth which supposedly bore a complete head-to-toe image of Jesus. If we were to believe that the shroud was in Constantinople in 1204 AD and taken during the siege, what happened between then and the 14th century? Also found among the relics in Constantinople was a dandelion cloth which is said to contain only a facial image of Yeshua, Jesus. Christians claim that the dandelion cloth first appeared in the possession of Muslim rulers from whom it had been taken by force in the year 944 AD. However, no other information had ever been recorded to prove whether it was true or not. Contrary to belief, the Shroud of Turin is one cloth, and the dandelion is something totally different. However, Ian Wilson, author of the Shroud book, states that they were really one and the same. He reports that Christians kept the shroud up until the destruction of Jerusalem, and after that, it was taken to Edessa, Syria, which is now modern-day Turkey. When the king of Edessa had abandoned his religion, the Christians feared persecution, and the possibility of the shroud being destroyed, so they hid it in a niche in the city walls. To store out of sight, it was folded in fours, so that the face was visible. This is why Ian Wilson's theory insists that the Shroud of Turin and the dandelion cloth are one and the same. But many people did not agree. So, Lan Wilson concluded, it seems that only the founder of the shroud would be able to tell the difference between the two. Ian Wilson also states that during the 14th century, when the shroud first came into existence, the people of Byzantine manufactured many cloths which were like the dandelion cloth, in which it would be regarded as miraculously produced. In fact, the Shroud of Turin is so popular, that as I have stated previously, there are 42 shrouds claiming authenticity. The shroud is known by Italians as the Santa Cinde, or the Holy Shroud. It is kept within Turin's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It lies rolled around a velvet staff, and it is wrapped in red silk, within a 4 feet long wooden casket ornamented in silver, with emblems of the Passion, or sufferings of Christ. Casket of the shroud is kept within an iron chest, wrapped in asbestos, which come from Middle English asbestius, from Latin asbestos, mineral or gem, from Greek, mineral or gem, and means fibrous mineral forms of impure magnesium silicate, used for fireproofing, electrical insulation, building materials, brake linings, and chemical filters, and it is scaled by 3 locks, each requiring a separate key. The iron chest is within a wooden box with a painted cover. The cover is all that is visible, and behind the 2 iron grills in the upper sepulchre section of the altar, the shroud is stored. Since 1694 AD, the shroud has been kept in a special shrine that was built for an overview of the high altar in the Cathedral of Turin, Italy's northwest region of Piedmont. There is no mystery behind the Shroud of Turin, just lies. This is a perfect example of how far Christians will go to keep their incomplete doctrine, Christianity, alive. Give it back. In time, it will fail because it lacks a strong foundation, and it lacks morals. So like a house built on water, it is destined to perish. The first time the shroud was displayed for the public it began in the 1800s AD. It was shown to the public on May 3rd for the day of the invention of the cross. This was stated by Peter Jennings, author of Face to Face with the Shroud. Other public showings of the so-called shroud were in 1804 AD for the visiting Pope Pius VII. In 1815 AD this was for the celebration of the pontiff's return to Italy, after his French captivity, and for the next 3 to 4 generations, of the marriages of the princes, and the heirs of the royal house of Savoy. The most important exhibition of the shroud was in May 1898 AD, during which time, the snapshot by a camera was taken. The shroud was exhibited for 8 days in memory of Vito Emanuele III, who was married in 1896 AD. This picture of the shroud was taken by Secondo Pia, 1855 to 1944 AD, who was also a lawyer. 2 photographic plates of the shroud were exposed, so that they could send as official records. Secondo Pia took the pictures back to his darkroom to process. As he poured on the developer, an image appeared, which had a roundness, a delicacy, and a molding appearance on the photographic plate. Secondo Pia believed he was looking at an image of Jesus. Exposures taken by other photographers confirmed the lifelike impressions. In photography, when a person or object is photographed, the lights and shades of the person or object are reversed, meaning the dark areas of all the exposures will become the light areas of the negative plate, and vice versa. The photographer prints the film, in order to get a positive image. However, with the shroud, the image was already negative. So when the negative plate was developed, a positive picture appeared, where everyone was quite surprised. In 1931 AD, the shroud was again displayed for light marriage of Umberto, the Prince of the House of Savoy. In 1933 AD it was viewed for the celebration of the supposed 19th centenary of Christ's so-called crucifixion. On November 23, 1973 AD the public exhibition of the shroud, by permission of Cardinal Pellegrino of Turin, was not displayed in the usual manner. This time, the shroud was shown by what they call the eye of modern man, but we call it television. That's right, television. This viewing of the shroud was called by the Vatican, the Roman Catholic religious officials, a television act of veneration. They thought that television could enable millions of people to see the shroud in detail and with less risk than would be expected at a public exhibition. The Vatican felt that if the shroud was viewed on television, it would end all talks, stating that the shroud was not authentic. Obviously it did not. Presently, the legal owner of the Shroud of Turin, by heredity, is the ex-king, Umberto II of the House of Savoy. However, he is in exile in Portugal, therefore, the person unofficially left in charge is the Cardinal Archbishop of Turin, Monsignor Anastasio Balestrero. Christians have assembled a task force of scientists, pathologists, chemists, photographic specialists, art historians, linguists, biblical scholars and textile experts so that they can make this mysterious relic become accepted by the world as the Shroud of Jesus. The following are techniques, methods, and conclusions which they drew concerning this Christian relic. Anatomy of the Shroud by José Luis Carreño, an accredited syndenologist. According to the Shroud researcher Luis Carreño, the photographic negative on the following diagram that appears positive to our eyes, has 2 parallel lines, which now appears white. These are the scorchings, he says, caused by the overheated metal edge of the which contained the shroud. During the Chambéry fire of 1532 AD the pair of dark triangles, were the patches stitched onto the linen by nuns, and this was in order to cover the holes made by a drop of molten metal, from a cummer of the On the forehead, appears a drop of blood, which the researchers say were due to a crown of thorns. On the right side of the chest is the flow of blood, which was caused by the thrust of the soldier's spear. The left hand partially conceals the right, and Luis Carreño says that the nail that affixed Jesus when he was on the cross, had to go through the wrist and not through the palm of the hand. Neither thumb is visible, only 4 fingers are visible on each hand. He also said the pull on each arm on the cross can be easily calculated from the angle formed by the direction of the blood on the wrists. According to him, the pull must have been calculated at about 200 pounds. Again he points out that, the back imprint on the second diagram shows that the crown of thorns was really a cap of thorns, pressed over the entire head. He claims that the friction against the wood of the cross pushed the thorns into the back of the head. According to him, both shoulders of Yeshua were bruised by the crossbeam as it slid down his back, and this was while he was carrying it to the place of crucifixion. The researcher, Luis Carreño, says that the scourges fell in pairs, chiefly on the back and shoulders, although they show up over the entire body. Quote, "This scourging was methodical, systematic, almost geometrical in design. It was not a hasty flogging administered to a resisting criminal. Far from it. Christ was scourged so that Pilate, on resenting this pitiful spectacle, could pacify the crowd and avoid giving a death sentence. He also stated that both feet were probably nailed by a single nail, the left leg arched over the right, and that the stiffness of death, rigor mortis, kept it bent in the tomb. Thus the people of Constantinople thought that one of the leg of their Lord was shorter than the other. Dr. Pierre Barbet, a Paris surgeon, states the following: the face shows several disfigurements, a swelling on the nose bridge and on the right cheek, a contusion below the right eye socket and on the left cheek, nose and lower lip. These marks are not open to question, he concluded by stalling. If these be the works of a forger, he must have been a super genius, an anatomist, a physiologist and an artist, a genius of such unexcelled quality that he must have been made to order. What Dr. Barbet says here leaves the impression that he thinks it is impossible for someone with those abilities to have existed. However, the Holy Scriptures clearly tells us, Matthew 24:24. And in time there shall rise up lying messiahs and false prophets, and shall have the power to do great signs and miracles, so great that if it was all possible they would be able to deceive the chosen ones. Right translation in Greek by Netter, Ephrodiatum Re. Dr. Barbet proceeded to show how Jesus was nailed to the cross at the wrists, by driving a nail through a part of freshly amputated hands, and then by using the body of another deceased patient from his hospital in Paris. Dr. Barbet stated that it is unlikely that the cross had been raised, in which he had crucified the dead body through the palms. And if that's the case, then the nail would have tore right through the palm of the hand. The x-rays that he made of a nail penetrating the bony structure of the wrists showed how only the wrists could have sustained the weight of the body. He states that while he drew a nail through the wrist, the thumbs, contracting under the spasm of tom nerves and tendons, jerked and bent towards the palm. He claims that this was the reason why there was no show of thumbs in front of the shroud. Dr. BCRBCT states, evidently, the thumb contracted in the spasm of the transfixion, became rigid under the palms as rigor mortis ensued after the Savior's death. This nail measures 8 to 10 inches. Here is an example of the nails used by the Romans. It was hammered through the hands and feet of accused victims, sentenced to death in order for the weight of the body to be supported. Shroudists state that the nail had to pass through the wrist in what is called distot space. But who do they think they are fooling? A nail that size would shatter someone's wrist bones. And then what support do you think they would have had? In no way could it support 200 pounds, as researcher Luis Carreño SDB stated. Archaeologists claim that despite countless crucifixions by the Romans, approximately 6,000 years after the revolt of the slave Spartacus, that not one crucified body had been found, until people started digging up a cemetery, so that the foundations could be laid for a building complex. In 1968 AD, while digging up the cemetery, the body of a crucified man was discovered. The name of the man was said to be Jehoanan. After physical examination, archaeologists reported that the forearms of the victim were scratched, and that other signs showed that he had been nailed to the crossbar above the wrist bones, between the radius and ulna. They stated that the victim had fractured leg bones, which indicated that there was deliberate smashing of the legs, in order to bring an end to his life. Thus, they say that archaeology has confirmed the medical evidence that the shroud's image is correct. The date of Jehoanan's death was estimated as having occurred between 7 AD and 70 AD. Biblical scholars say that the discovery of that body proved to be helpful in their research to make the Shroud of Turin a reality. The scourging. Scourging. Verb. 1. To whip or flog. 2. To punish, chastise or afflict severely. Biblical scholars state that the Savior was beaten with a Roman flagrum. According to Monsignor Giulio Ricci, an archivist at the Vatican and a syndonologist scholar, the Shroud of Turin shows more than 100 flagellation marks that are discernible. Shroudists say that when a flagellum is laid on human skin with force, that it would produce wounds, which in turn would produce marks, exactly like those on the shroud. Ricci continues to say that the flagellation marks that the robe or tunic would have covered, the back, chest, and upper arms, appeared smudged on the shroud, whereas the marks that were not touched by the tunic, lower arms and legs, the face, appear decidedly more distinct. Shroudists state that the Shroud of Turin bears blood marks, confirming how the torso and the thighs were covered with scourge marks from the use of a Roman flagrum. Yet they say this persecution caused him to lapse into a coma, from which he was revived when he was placed in the tomb, resurrect. This phenomenon is especially visible on the shoulders, where all syndonologists agree the man on the shroud carried a heavy, rough beam. Notice, if the cross that Jesus was made to carry had been in direct contact with the lacerated shoulders, the lacerations would have widened, forming wider sores. On the contrary, they have kept their shape. This would not have happened with the presence of a robe protecting the shoulders wounded by the scourges. Kurt Berne, otherwise known as Hans Neighbor, the German syndonologist, came up with the theory that Jesus supposedly did not die on the cross, but survived. Robert Wilcox, author of the book entitled The Shroud, states that neighbor saw the tip of the lance, which had been thrusted up into Jesus' side, sticking out of the left pectoral muscle. According to neighbor's vision, the lance tip had not come to rest within the chest cavity, as most theological experts believed. It had emerged several inches above the left nipple. He even made it a point to state that he could see a tiny wound mark at the pectoral area. It was circular, and could be differentiated from the marks made by scourging, which were straight and smaller. It is meaningless to say a hound is in the space between the 5th and 6th ribs without qualification, because there can be a difference of 6 to 7 inches in height between the front and back of the space due to the downward slope of the ribs. Dr. Davis Willis, a well-known British physician, objected to neighbor's lance theory. He said that neighbor had calculated the exact location of the entrance wound incorrectly. The entrance wound as it appears on the shroud is clearly at the front of the rib slope, and if neighbor had only realized that, his simulated spear thrust would definitely have hit the heart. Neighbor was charged with forgery because the anatomical diagram of an adult human heart which neighbor claims he had used was actually the diagram of a young child's chest cavity. So the reason why the Nabirian spear would have missed such a heart is that the organs were not fully grown. Dr. Willis went on to say that the piercing of the heart is irrelevant because the executioners, the Roman soldiers trained in the art of using their weapons and while qualified to know when the death had ensued, were convinced that their work was complete in the case of his companions, otherwise they would have broken Judas, who they thought was the Messiah Jesus' legs, as they did in the case of the 2 robbers. The piercing of the side, then, was in the nature of a coup de grâce, literally stroke of mercy, not the finishing off of someone half dead. As you can see, these experts do not have their lies straight. Everyone wants to be the chief theorist, and none of them know what they are talking about because their evidence is not substantial enough to back them up. What they are trying to insinuate is that in order for the shroud to have received the image that it has, the victim, Judas Iscariot, and not Yeshua, Jesus, had to have been alive. They claim that the body was covered with blood, which means that the heart must still have been pumping, and the blood must still have been circulating through his body, thus causing a bloody discharge to escape from his wounds. However, dead bodies do not bleed. If a man's side is punctured when there is fluid in the chest cavity, air will go in, and no fluids would be coming out. In order for fluid to escape, it has to be sucked out the puncture under pressure. It is amazing to think how much ingenuity has been utilized to authenticate what is obviously a legend. We also know that the body of whom was thought to be Jesus, was washed of any blood and anointed before it was wrapped in the shroud, because the book of John says that he was buried in the manner in which the Judahites, from the tribe of Judah, bury their dead, John 19:40. 1 Corinthians 15:13-14. But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then is the Messiah not risen, and if the Messiah has not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain. Right translation in Greek by Netter, Ephrodiatum Re. The textile experts of the 20th century have identified the fabric of the Shroud of Turin as a herringbone twill unknown in France until the 14th century. It has, however, been identified as fabric known during Roman times in Syria, Pompeii, and Mainz. It is still being made in Syria today. Although the markings on the cloth could not have been made during medieval France, they could have been made in Constantinople at any time, which is the supposed place where the shroud first turns up. In 1973 AD, samples of threads from the fabric were used in testing. By 1976 AD, Professors Reyes, of the Ghent Institute of Textile Technology, reported traces of cotton, which could only mean that the fabric for the shroud was made on a machine that was used for weaving cotton. Since cotton is not grown in Europe, it is likely that the fabric came down from the Middle East. However, it is only circumstantial evidence that the imprints could have been made there. Because around the 13th century, Europe and Spain were flourishing in the importation of the cotton manufacturing industry. Therefore, the forger could have been from Europe also. Another scientist, Dr. Max Frey, examined the pollen found on the shroud. He reported that securing a specific date from the pollen would not be possible, but the places determined by the pollen could be discovered. He found possible travels of the shroud to be the Jordan Valley, Palestine, Syria, and Turkey. Concerning the dark stains which shroudists claimed to have been blood from the crucifixion, tests were made that revealed no traces of blood. However, shroudists argue that the original blood was destroyed by some type of mystical force, released during the resurrection. So if it wasn't blood, what was it? If the stains were somehow caused by a remnant of blood, would it have shown up on the tests? Think about it. A microscopist by the name of Dr. Walter Macron made tests on 32 examples taken from the shroud. His report stated that significant amounts of very fine red iron oxide were found on the shroud. This chemical, red iron oxide, was used since prehistoric time as a paint pigment. To further question the genuinity of the shroud, These paint pigments were found only in areas of the image and not on the fabric as a whole. His conclusion was that the entire image appears to be the work of a skillful, well-informed artist. A professional magician, Joe Nickel, performed an interesting experiment of his own with cloth, in order to find out what situations would produce an image like that found on the shroud. He discovered that a bas-relief, scriptural projection of figure forms from a flat background that projects very little of the background of a real human body, other than a statue. It would give a distorted image of a human face and figure, like that which is shown on the Shroud of Turin. He was able to do this by soaking the cloth in hot wafer. I carefully melted it to a bas-relief, allowed to dry, and then applied pigment, rather as one would do a rubbing of a gravestone. I selected a mixture of myrrh and aloes as my pigment, stroking two on with a dauber. Careful application produces the negative return positive images of remarkable fidelity. These scientific tests were shown to discredit the authenticity of the shroud. Even if the shroud happened by way of a miracle, wouldn't there at least have been a trace of something concrete that could help to prove its legitimacy? We're talking about a man who bleeds like you, cries like you, fears death like you, sins like you, was baptized like you and dies like you. So why hasn't anyone else's image been transferred onto a cloth when they die? Vaporography, thermography, Kirlian photography and the scorch theory all work in a similar way. Thermography is an offset or an extension of infrared photography. It is used in hospitals to detect diseases such as breast cancer, etc. The principal use for thermography is the usage of body heat, which penetrates certain photographic chemical emulsions to make diagnostic pictures which appear as negative images. Vatican officials that are obsessed with proving the authenticity of the shroud have gone to the extent of killing dogs, and using them in experiments such as these. These photographic chemical emulsions can be purchased today in spray paint form. These produced images on popular t-shirts. These emulsions had not been combined and formulated for sale to the public before World War II. The cameras, machinery, and photographic technology did not develop before the 1800s AD. However, the process of heat forming can take place without the aid of these things, but it takes a very long period of time before a result is seen. Which brings us to the theory concerning how the image of Judas, thought to be Jesus, was left on the shroud. According to Shroudists, the heat of the corpse had the ammoniac vapors, which interacted with the burial spices upon the cloth, and it produced the image. Now this causes two problems. First of all, Shroudists claim that there was no time to wash the body of Judas and anoint it with spices, so the spices had to be laid beside the body, after which he was covered with the shroud. But if this is true, then how is it possible for the heat of his body and the burial spices to interact, thus producing a full front and back image on the shroud? Second of all, we have stated that the process of vaporization and dehydration etc. is a natural process which can leave a negative image on a surface, but it takes a very long period of time. And the body of he who is thought to be Yeshua was not in the tomb long enough for any sort of image to have been produced on the cloth, especially such a third-dimensional image as is portrayed on the shroud. The image that appears on the Shroud of Turin is what Christians see as their verification of the so-called crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The image found on the shroud contains certain features that biblical scholars and shroud advocates attribute to Yeshua, Jesus, such as wounds on the wrists, the side, the head, and scorches all over the body. According to the Synoptic Gospels Matthew, Mark and Luke, these things describe Yeshua. This is why the media has saturated the public with so many representations of their Savior. These representations are called icons. The definition of icon according to the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language is as follows: a representation or picture of a sacred Christian personage, itself regarded as sacred, especially in the tradition of the Eastern churches. According to Reverend Marcus Green of the Order of St. Benedict, certain features in the representation of Yeshua seem to indicate that the artist drew their inspirations directly and or indirectly from the shroud. He also included that the shroud shows a bruise across the forehead, 3 sides of a square between the eyebrows, enlarged nostrils, and a divided beard across the throat. The icons that are seen today do not come anywhere near the description mentioned above. Notice in the following pictures, the difference in appearance between the 11th century and the 20th century concepts. It is quite obvious that they don't know how Yeshua, Jesus, really looked. If the shroud serves as a model of how he really looked, then why are there so many different paintings of him? The Luciferians are trying to fool you. They are doing a very good job at it. With all of these different leaders now coming out saying that Jesus is really a black man, none of them can seem to agree with which picture they want to use. Thus, they will confuse the next generation of children that are coming up. What all of them need to do is meet and agree on a standard picture for the children's sake, if no other reason. The next thing that is going to happen is that all of these churches are going to be at war about who should use what, and I think this. I think that nobody is looking at it from a we standpoint of view. The type of material that Joseph used was linen, yet the Shroudists, professors, those who profess to know, and biblical scholars have a piece of cloth that they say is the burial cloth of Judas, who they thought to be Yeshua, Jesus. This cloth is supposed to be made of herringbone twill. After researching out the date that the herringbone twill came into use, we find out that it was way after the time of Yeshua, Jesus. Riatro Savio, archivist and syndonologist, one who studies the shroud, says, herringbone dates back to AD 130. Professor Gilbert Reyes of the University of Ghent, Belgium states, some of the textile indications seem to point to the Holy Land and great antiquity. The material is linen, commonly used in ancient Palestine for grave clothes. The weave is a herringbone twill, a pattern not known to the ancients, although plain weave was much more common in those days. Now look at the time period he placed on this discovered linen. The thread appears to be hand-spun. An ancient technique, after about AD 1200. Look at the two different time periods which the Shroudists have submitted, as the dates when the herringbone was first used, 1200 AD and 1300 AD Anno Domini to the historians, his storytellers, means after the death of Christ or in the year of our Lord. This means that it was not until 300 years on 1200 years after the supposed crucifixion of Christ, that they began to use herringbone twill weave. In the above quotes the so-called scholars are telling you that they discovered the Shroud of Turin, which is made of linen material, that has a herringbone weave pattern. Yet there is no record that the herringbone twill weave was fabric, with a diagonal rib. There are said to be 4 qualities. One so fine that each thread contained 360 fibers. Hebrews also developed great skills at the linen looms, and they even reported their product to the Nile Valley for loincloths. The comfortable texture of linen made it popular for the garments of royalty and aristocrats. It is this type of linen that was used for Egyptian mummy bandages. Sometimes piles of linen sheets are 60 feet long, beautifully fringed, and they were piled in the tomb chambers of the deceased. According to the Bible, the word linen appears 104 times. Notice if you will that in each instance the words for linen varies because it describes its different functions, John 19:40. In summary, after Judas, not Jesus, was crucified, taken down from the cross and washed, anointed with aromatic ointments and treated with spices, he was wrapped in linen and a bandage or hijab, a veil, napkin was placed over his face. Another extremely important point is the fact that the image on the Shroud of Turin could not have been as precise as it seems on the shroud. Judas' body was wrapped in burial clothes, which means that when the shroud was unwrapped, the image, if it were true that there was an image, would have been dispersed so that you would not be able to see such a complete head-to-toe image as it seems on the so-called Holy Shroud, John 2:19-21. Now we would like to ask, what kind of physical proof do the Christians have to prove the shroud is authentic? None, because they have no substantial or logical information to back up their conclusions. The Times newspaper admits that the previous examinations performed by Shroudists have failed to determine what caused the image on the linen. It brings out one important point, however, and that is, that the Roman Catholic Church urges its followers to worship this relic, yet they know that it is not real, and they have no test to prove that it will guarantee man's entrance into paradise. In another article published, a month later, in the same newspaper, they revealed that during the Middle Ages there was an outburst of relics being displayed for the sole purpose of collecting money for the upkeep of the church, state, and ministers. Towns would steal relics of famous persons and things so that they could gain enough attention to make a profit. The Vatican Council states that the shroud is an extraordinary document of the life and redemptive mission of Christ in existence, one that should take its place alongside the New Testament. The attention that the Vatican gives to the shroud shows a reoccurrence of the 14th century relic veneration. The Catholic Church is losing its followers, and consequently is losing the funds that it once had to make it so popular. This is why they will seek any means necessary to gain its power and wealth. So why the shroud? A large number of people, as we already know, are beginning to realize that the Shroud of Turin is a fake, especially because of all the controversy surrounding it. Christians are beginning to realize that their lies are not working anymore and that with every day that passes, they lose more and more followers. Thus they have to come up with new ideas that they hope will make people hold on to their Christian followers. Shroudists are now saying that they have new evidence with regards to the shroud, and that this evidence will be put on display at Connecticut College for you to see. Evidence that they say they have been holding on to for 3 years. But why? The reality is that this display is nothing more than a gimmick. A means for them to make money because of these tests which they made had in fact proven that the shroud is authentic. Then they waited 3 years before telling the world. It would seem that after making such an extraordinary discovery, that they would be more than happy with the idea of telling everyone, so that the controversies regarding the shroud could stop. But like I said before, these Christians only want people to come out and see the shroud so that they can spend money. Why? Because Christians need the money so that they can finance the casket, and buy all the other material necessary to upkeep the shroud. It is just like when you second someone advertising. They have new findings concerning the Bible, and when you see someone go, wherever you must go, to hear these fascinating new facts, what you find is that it is nothing more than another translation of the Bible. Then there you are. You have spent money on traveling and probably an entrance fee only to find out that you are right back where you started. Knowing no more and no less. What Christians have to realize is that people are no longer accepting things on blind faith. And if they, Christians, say that the Shroud of Turin is authentic and that it has the power to heal, as they have already done, and someone touches that shroud and it doesn't heal him, that person is not going to believe that the shroud is holy no matter what they say. People today are so anxious to find out the truth, that many times they are deceived by people who claim that they are healers and that they have the answers. Matthew 24:11-12. The Christians were some of the first to use symbols. They made statues of myriad gods in the form of men. These shroudists had people believing that they had indeed found new startling information concerning the Shroud of Turin, only for us to later find out that they are saying the same thing that hundreds of other shroudists have been saying for years. They claim that the blood stains on the shroud are composed of hemoglobin. But as stated before, according to Walter Macrone, a Chicago microscopist, that is not true. He says that the stains on the shroud is paint that was applied to it in the 14th century. He states that what he found was iron oxide, a red pigment commonly used by artists in the Middle Ages. Shroudists state that a carbon-14 test, a test in which strands of the shroud are put through a machine which then determines the age of the linen, would prove whether the shroud is authentic or not. However, the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, does not agree to give them the samples needed for testing because they claim it will ruin the shroud. But who are they kidding? The question is, what are they trying to hide? The fact that the shroud is fake? The Shroud of Turin is quickly losing its popularity. In fact, many people now believe that it does not belong to Jesus. They are now saying that it belongs to King Tut.